All right, guys, we'll get going on the last little part here of Swat Maps. I think all these things kind of tie in together. Swat Maps, I'm sure everybody's at least heard a little bit about it. And Gavin's up here because I think, kind of like we said all day long, is this is about collaboration. This is about trying to find answers for ourselves and our community. Gavin and Von Miller, they've been doing SWAT maps for a couple years now. We just got started this fall. We all got going at the same time. They just got a little bit jump on it compared to us. It's one of those things. You look on the map north of the border. There's not many acres in Canada that isn't SWAT mapped and using variable rate. In Montana, there's not very many. So I think it's one of those things. As more people jump on board and become part of it, we're going to get better data. It's going to help all of us, and we can learn a lot more things from doing that. But I guess I just kind of wanted to, like I said, it's more of a collaboration thing than a competitive thing. So that's why Gavin's up here too, is because we're both doing it. And you know, if you have a preference who you'd want to work with or whatever, it's not about that. It's about just who's ever closer to you or whoever can get to you or whatever. So Gavin's just going to say a couple things that he's maybe learned the last couple of years doing it. And then we've got Wes Anderson from Swat Maps. He's the VP of Agronomy that's going to kind of go through a little bit of, he's going to show you a couple of the fields of our own actual fields. The field that we're going to have those trials on, they're both by Kremlin there, to give everybody a little bit of a reference of what those fields look like. To me, they're our flattest, most even fields, and the variability even in those fields is quite surprising. So go ahead, Gavin, if you want a couple things.
Yeah, so we started down this road of SWAT maps because we're running into acidity issues, and using yield maps or satellite imagery just doesn't make sense. It needs to start in the ground first, or the problem is. So that's what this whole program is you're breaking out variability in soil, you're using elevation with an RTK unit, and modeling these zones, and you're chasing it from the ground up versus a top-down approach. So we found acidity, and the acidity isn't consistent, like we're seeing in 5 to 8 pHs in the same field. And so a blanket rate of lime just doesn't make sense, nor is it feasible in our area, because we have to go all the way down to Warren to ship this stuff up for $100 a ton. And when you got to fix a bad problem, it takes a lot. So we're just using it as a tool. We're going to break this dive into low pH, start raising it. It's not going to be a silver bullet and fix it this year, but it'll be fix it from here on out. So, and then there's a bunch of other benefits. I mean, you're getting variable rate maps for everything. So we're variable rate in our seed, our starters, everything through the drills, and then our top dressing as well. So.
All right, Wes, can you hear me?
I'll pass this
on. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
All right, yeah, the floor is yours if you want to kind of go ahead and start kind of giving everybody an idea what SWAT Maps is.
All right. I'm assuming you can see my slides too, right?
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thanks for having me, everybody, and hopefully you've had a good day. Yeah, I'll give a quick overview here of what SWAT maps are, or soil, water, and topography maps. Gavin's given a nice little starter to that too, talking about ground up and why we do that. Just gotta get, here we go. Okay. I wasn't going to go through all this detail, but I just want to give some reassurance, I guess, that we're not some sort of fly-by-night software company that's popped up in the last 5 years during the boom. Croptomistic Technology is actually the company, and it's been around a long time. Technically, Croptomistic is only about 6 years old now, but really SWAT Maps and all the technology around SWAT Maps, including software and hardware, has been around for well over 10 years now. So there's farms in Saskatchewan that have been using SWAT Maps for variable rate fertilizer and seed for at least 10 years. So, and some of those maps are actually even still in use today. our founder and CEO currently is an agronomist himself, and really just developed the technology as a better way to manage inputs and improve ROI. So a little more detail here. So SWOT maps, as Gavin alluded to, are very much a ground up, and we're focused on soil and water variability. Why it's called soil, water, and topography is because those are the three things that ultimately go into the map. And there's no cookie cutter approach. It's a very adaptable system to mapping different landscapes. So, I mean, I'm speaking to you from Southeast Queensland in Australia right now. Obviously, much different soils in age and how they were developed. Compared to Montana, or if we go to northeastern Saskatchewan, it's different yet again. So the unique part of SWOT maps is we use multiple layers of data that go together in some way that best represent the factors that drive variability in that field. Okay. And as I'm sure all of you know, sometimes that's texture, sometimes it's salinity, sometimes it's topography, maybe it's just even elevation. We do even have the ability to bring in some soil color maps sometimes when required too. So at the end of the day, we can use a lot of different layers. The important thing is getting a map that best represents the variability that occurs. And these three factors, soil, water, and topography, are really all interrelated, right? So topography over time drives water flow, erosion, where soil moves and collects. So I'm sure a lot of you have those nice depressions that have collected topsoil over the years, and can crank out 100 bushel wheat on even an average year, right? Those are the spots where you're watching the yield map and you get pretty excited when you go through those spots. But at the end of the day, that variability exists for a lot of different reasons. They are also relatively stable properties, right? So, I mean, soil water obviously can fluctuate year to year, but at the end of the day, a dry part of the field is always going to be the driest part of the field. The wettest part of the field is generally always going to be the wettest part of the field. So most of those things don't change. So again, this is just a visual representation of some individual map layers, I'll call them, that can be integrated into the map. And this is quite a complex process, and something we provide training on to all of our partners. The maps do require ground truthing after we collect the data to make sure that we fully understand things like the electroconductivity layer, for instance. So some of you may be familiar with Varus. They've been around a long time. Maybe you've heard of an EM38. That's a device that's actually made by a company in Canada called Geonics, and they've been around for a long time. The EM38 has actually been used in research for many, many decades, mainly as a tool to sort of map salinity. So it's very, very good at mapping any saline soils or even just sodic soils that are higher in sodium and have poor structure and drainage issues. But what we've done, or one of our engineers have done, is figured out a way to essentially mount one of those devices in an enclosure and put it on the back of a truck or a side-by-side to be able to really efficiently map a landscape and make it a much more economical way of mapping soil variability. At the same time, we would get very high quality elevation data. So much of the US actually has good quality LiDAR, but we also have an RTK, a true survey grade RTK system that can be integrated as well to collect that data. That elevation data then is processed into a bunch of different water related layers in a topography model. So on the far right here, you can actually see the topography map, which is fairly different than the elevation map. So, and in most cases, really, a lot of our water flow within a field is driven by topography, not so much elevation. So again, in some true full tillage systems, sometimes we can get a soil color map, but it's pretty rare that we can get a good quality map to use here. So that would be less common. But so the EC data really tells us in most cases, first of all, for sure, any salinity, it picks up very, very well. And it does do a very good job of relative texture variability, because how well the soil conducts electricity is governed a lot by clay content and moisture. So there's a complicated graphic and I won't really dwell on it very long, but my main point is that a lot of the time our goal is to understand plant available nutrients, because that's what drives yield potential along with available water. Okay, so if we understand what nutrients are available to plants, then we can understand how much more needs to be added to reach our target yield potential, whatever that may be. The thing is that's affected by many, many things. And it's no coincidence that organic matter and mineralization, or the biological component of the soil, are at the heart of this graphic. And that's a really important point that I want to pause on. pH, really, you could argue, is sort of also, and water. Those are really the central components of this whole system, right? And Gavin mentioned pH, and I've been reading for a long time. Montana's been struggling with low pH soils too. We have also been experiencing that in Western Canada. So straight to the north in Alberta, for instance, we're seeing a lot of very acidic soils, but certainly not in 100% of the field. Until you go way into the far north, it's usually only 10, 15, maybe 20% of the field has a pH below 5.5 that we need to start looking at liming. So, but we do certainly see that affecting soil health and all the things that we need the soil to do, which is ultimately supply nutrients to the growing crop. All this starts, though, my main point starts with topography and elevation that drives things like water and erosion, and the parent material. In other words, what Mother Nature left us. And there's nothing we can do about that. She did what she did 10,000 years ago, or well, maybe where you guys are more like 12,000 years ago. But if it's sand, it's sand. If it's clay, it's clay. If you got hills, you got hills. It is what it is. But all those things drive all this other to get to plant available nutrients. So just a quick, I'm going to show some maps, obviously, so just so everybody sort of understands what we're looking at. The SWAT map is always relative to itself within each field. Okay, so a zone 1 in one field isn't necessarily the same as zone 1 in another field. A lot of the time in the same farm in a given area, there will be a lot of similarities, certainly, but it can differ. So some common delineation, for example, if you have salinity, we would normally zone that into a zone 10. So that's the most saline. Zones 5 and 6 are typically those nice mid-slope or relatively flat areas, but that are fairly well drained. Whereas zone 1, the red zones, that's typically, the top of a hill or maybe the sandiest soil. It's just basically the driest part of the field. That could be due to texture or landscape position, or even often both. So you get this general delineation. No matter where you are in the world, you can look at a SWAT map and understand this general delineation of dry to wet. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that the highest yields, I know you guys are in a water limited environment, but that doesn't mean the highest yields are in zone 10. Often we are mapping some soil problems that you didn't even necessarily know you had, whether it's slight salinity, maybe subsoil constraints like sodicity. Maybe zone 10 is just an area that occasionally gets a bit too wet. And especially when that happens earlier in the season, it does tend to cause yield loss. So we would often see in your geography, we would often see the highest yields in these sort of zones 5 to 8. And in a really, really wet year, should you get that, maybe it's been a few years since you've had that, those high yields would shift upslope generally. And we've seen some extreme examples of that, and I'll share some in a minute. Along with that delineation, we tend to get topsoil depth differences and organic matter differences that would follow this trend like we see in the right. So these are actually 2-foot soil profiles here from central Saskatchewan, but you get the idea. Generally, zone 1 has shallower topsoils, usually less developed. Sometimes it's just been eroded away simply, and some of the original topsoil that was in zone 1 is actually sitting in zone 10. So it all depends on the history of that field. Another way to look at this is we're dividing the field up into smaller areas that could all fit in one of these 9 blocks here, okay? And we've had the ability to look at or zone, if you will, by yield potential using actual yield monitors or yield data, or even, NDVI data, satellite imagery. The problem that we've seen with that approach is that within each of those categories, so maybe it's a high yield potential area typically, we can see different fertilizer response probability. Okay, so we've got those maybe rich depressions with a lot of topsoil that's collected in over the years from erosion. A lot of the time, those parts of the field actually don't need a lot of inputs, even though they're high yielding. Okay, on the other hand, we've got maybe a mid slope that's consistently high yielding and has been under fertilized for many years, and the soil's just starting to get a little bit tired, and it needs some love and investment. We've seen some really interesting things, and probably for me, this has been the biggest eye opener, but sometimes some hills that have eroded over the years actually just, they might not be the highest yielding part of the landscape by any means because they're more water limited, but they might be extremely responsive to phosphorus or zinc or sulfur. Okay, and we've seen numerous examples of that. So that's just some examples. Something else we've done a lot of over the years is, and this started several years ago after doing some plant counts in different SWAT zones, and we realized there was quite a difference in mortality rates of seed across the landscape. And it was quite well correlated to these SWAT zones. And there's lots of reasons we could get to. I'm not really going to get into that, but at the end of the day, we can look at seed in a similar way as to the way we look at fertilizer, in that you've got varying population response probability across the landscape. So a dry knoll maybe can't support a very high population of wheat or corn. Corn's probably the most intuitive crop in respect to how we manage this actually. So a dry part landscape maybe can only handle, 27,000 population of corn, if that. Whereas those really rich, good depression areas that have more water availability and deep topsoil maybe can actually handle a 34,000 population. But anyway, it's the same sort of mindset with wheat or even canola. On the other hand, some other crops like lentils are a bit of a different approach, and I'll give an example with that in a moment as well. So how do we do it? It all starts with mapping initially. So we have to physically drive the field. So this is what Cody or Gavin would be doing. Usually we have this SWAT box here, this device on the back of a truck. That's, if we look globally, most of our partners would have it on the back of a truck. This is actually my mapping unit that I use here. But anyway, it's just a plastic enclosure with an EM device that collects the EC, and then usually we're getting that elevation data one way or another too. Here's an example just to reinforce this yield thing again, because this is where I think most people get a bit hung up because we're so used to yield. At the end of the day, yield's a dynamic layer and varies year to year based on in-season rainfall. This is a field from central Alberta at a college, actually. So it's sort of a demonstration farm. So here's the SWAT map. So you can see we're looking at it in 3D a bit. So you can see those zone ones are more the upper landscape positions that would shed water. In this field, there's it's not salinity, but there's some higher sodium and poor draining soils in zone 10. So some real just challenges around soil structure and nutrient and water utilization. But we had two contrasting years. So 2020 was an extremely wet year. In fact, further north in the higher rainfall zone where I was based at the time, we had almost every field yielded the most in zone 1. And in fact, zone 6 to 10 were flooded out completely in the majority of fields. So it was a very, very wet year. And we see that trend here. So we had, over 120 bushel barley in zone 1 and just a linear decline to zone 10. Okay. 2021, on the other hand, ended up quite dry. And we see this more typical trend probably for drier regions of a little bit depressed yields increasing to zone 6 and 7, but then actually still declining again in zone 9 and 10. And again, these poor yields in zones 9 and 10 are more related to soil problems that aren't easily fixed and exist year in and year out, regardless of the rainfall. So that's just an example of how those yields can vary year to year depending on rainfall. And again, here's an example, the rainfall. Sorry, I've got metric units here, but 25 mils is an inch. So in 2020, we just had those first 2 months in May and June just were a killer. That's just way too much rain for us in Western Canada in those months. And a young crop just can't handle that amount of rain really was the issue. So very, very contrasting rainfall patterns, really. Different field, actually same farm, but just a different field. And this one happens to have some salinity in the zone 10. So again, we see that depressed yield. This was in the drier year again in 2021. So we see that typical pattern. That farm has a crop scan sensor on the combine. So they're actually mapping protein as well, which allows us to do some interesting things. And start sort of dividing the field, if you will, up into 4 different quadrants. And what this can help us with is understanding, okay, in these areas with low yield and low protein, there's a good chance that there just was not enough nitrogen on there, or perhaps we lost a lot of nitrogen early in the season. Okay, high yield and high protein. Well, in this case, in this year, it was more just because we ended up with, a drier finish and higher proteins. But those are areas you could look at potentially even cutting back and saving a bit of nitrogen if the protein was excessively high. So we can do some of this yield analysis, and, should you have protein data, we could include that too as part of a bit of an add-on service that we call the Yield Potential Program. And the guys there can talk a bit more about that individually with you, but we have a couple of requirements. One would be fully SWAT mapped farms. And the second requirement would be actual good quality yield data that you're collecting at harvest. So, but that's another add-on service to add a little more analysis into the data. All right, so to touch on some local examples, this is one of Cody's fields, as he alluded to. I've got showing in 3D, and I've got the elevation exaggerated a fair bit here, but it's always nice to have local examples. So this is an interesting one in that it looks like it probably has what we would in Western Canada probably call a side hill seep, or some regions you'd call it a spring. Sometimes these areas can be saline, sometimes they're just wet, but at the end of the day, it's often for whatever reason. Usually it's due to its relative location in the landscape related to elevation, but you'd get water infiltrating in a different area. Maybe it's not even within the field, but it could be flowing down through this where the red area is in zone 1 and 2, going down to an impermeable layer and then seeping out the side of a slope, essentially. And we see this quite often and can map them really effectively. And it doesn't necessarily take a lot of elevation or topography to see these either. So, which is probably the case here too. So So again, that general delineation we got in sort of zone 1 and 2 here. You can see your upper landscape positions, water shedding areas. There was lower CEC in this one, I believe, down around 15 or something, if I remember right. So we can, see some maybe leaching potential. This is where some of our mobile nutrients like nitrate and sulfur or even chloride can leach and move down slope or down through the profile. These are also the areas that are often subject to erosion or maybe if it's a sandier, low organic matter soil, that's where we would often see the lowest pH. So Gavin touched on that variable rate lime. Wholeheartedly agree. It's really variable rate. If you can identify where those acid soils are, it's the only economical way to do it. And we're facing the same thing in Canada too. So those are the areas that would have often the lowest buffer potential. In other words, the least ability to resist acidification over time. And that works fairly well for variable rate lime and when those are acidic, which wasn't the case in this field, but just an example. In this field, we've got these sort of mid-slope areas. They're quite high pH and very calcareous soil, but probably productive, right? And you often would get very consistently high yielding because they're never too wet or too dry, right? They're just average. These are often the places, as is the case in this one, where you can probably feel comfortable in investing a lot more and feel confident about a good ROI as well. And in this one, this zone 10 had some fairly high sodium and probably some structure issues, I would imagine. And the EC was a little bit high. In other words, it's a bit saline. So even though there's lots of water and nutrients there, in fact, there was excessive nutrients there, the crop really has a tough time using the water. And as a result, it just, you get poor yields and the nutrients collect there over time. So what might we do with that? Because that's really the important part. This is just a mock prescription, something that we would typically do in Western Canada. And of course, every area is different. And I'm not going to pretend to be the agronomy expert for Montana. That's what our local partners are for. But I just wanted to share some sort of typical examples of some things we've done that have been successful. So this is just a variable rate report that we can create in our software that shows the rates of each product. So we've got 3 layers here: seed, a phosphate product, and urea, just as an example. We have variable rated 5 products all at the same time. So Borgo, for instance, offers a cart with 5 different tanks if they have a saddle tank. So it can get pretty complicated, but when you're doing that much in one pass, it also creates a lot of value in one pass when you can do that. So for wheat seed, we would often follow a trend, something like this. And one thing we've had a lot of success in is increasing seeding rates in some of those zones that have some soil related challenges. So maybe it's slight salinity or sodicity that dramatically increases mortality. I would sort of expect that to happen in most years in this field here too. And the problem is you end up with a thin stand, and guess what happens? Kochia, right? We get weeds moving in. Kochia is the big one for a lot of those drier regions. And what we're doing is increasing the seed, knowing that we're going to get the mortality. But we're trying to get enough crop established that it's a little more competitive and can help battle some of that weed pressure and help out the herbicides a little bit. Phosphate rates, that gets a little more into a complicated discussion involving probably pH and soil phos levels. Obviously, we see a fairly good range here from only 13 ppm, which in our experience is getting a bit low, up to 22, which isn't bad. So we can vary some of those rates quite a bit, in my opinion. And of course, nitrogen is going to be very year specific. A lot of the time, we've found a lot of value in understanding mineralization potential. Now, you guys in your area don't have the dramatic organic matter differences that we do to the north, but you're still going to get some differences in mineralization based on relative moisture of the soil, some organic matter, and probably topsoil depth in a lot of cases. And sometimes, like I said earlier, sometimes the high yielding areas don't necessarily need the highest rates of nitrogen. So you can see we got some topsoil. This is just the topsoil nitrate tests showing here. So we've got anywhere from 8 pounds in that probably consistently high yielding zone to 70 pounds sitting there just in the top 6 inches. I think there was another 60 pounds of nitrate below that too. So that's a good example of those problem areas that accumulate nutrients over time, and you can really, really cut back. So in this example, I've got actually just the urea just shuts right off in that zone. So that's yeah, that's just an example of an approach we might take with wheat. Relatively simple, but fairly easy to do and effective. Here's this is another field. So this is just a soil test, but I just wanted to highlight a couple things. So as Gavin sort of alluded to, you know, we got a pH range of 6.4, which really is actually just nice. That's not really a problem, but that would be the zone you'd be wanting to keep an eye on though, because obviously again, that buffer potential is probably quite low. We got a fairly low CEC, relatively low organic matter, and that's the part of the field that's probably going to have acidity issues first. Okay. On the other hand, we get very high pH soil up to 8. So that now we run into issues with like heaps of calcium there, and that's where phosphorus is going to be fixed all the time, right? So the main challenge there becomes almost phosphorus availability, and we can see that actual soil test P being quite low, or the lowest in that zone as well. So again, good range of soil P here. Common problem in zone 1 is low sulfur levels. So you know, this is a sulfur level in that zone that is definitely too low for canola, and even some other crops like wheat or barley or something. I would really want to be putting on some sulfur with those sorts of levels, and in our experience that we've had based on in-season ground truthing and tissue testing. So that's just an example there. Good thing in this field, we don't have any sodicity or salinity issues. So that's great. But we do see quite a range of cation balances, and yeah, would be interesting to follow up some of this with some in-season tissue testing. And I just wanted to share an example with a pulse crop, and lentils are an interesting one. And one of the best quotes I've ever heard was actually from a South Australian farmer, James Venning. I heard him speak at a conference, and he said, "You can never trust lentils to look after themselves." And I had a lot of experience with lentils years ago in southern Saskatchewan myself, and they're an interesting crop. And we've had some success, of course, in wetter years. Their big issue becomes disease quite often. And that disease often comes with sort of the overly rank vegetative growth, right? And where the canopies close in, and you really just can't control any airflow. And sometimes, again, that might only happen on 15 or 20% of the field, and then usually in those nice depression areas with lots of good soil and good water availability. And we've actually been able to manage that a little bit, manage the canopy essentially with variable rate seed. So you intentionally, in those parts of the field, cut back a bit on seeding rate, and knowing that those plants will branch more and grow taller and be more vegetative, because that's just what they're going to do. There's really no way to handle that. We don't have any growth regulators in lentils yet, unfortunately. On the other hand, in those drier parts of the landscape, we can increase the seeding rates, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but plants like lentils and soybeans and dry beans can actually respond to that, because what happens is the interplant competition causes them to grow a little taller and extend some internodes and get those first pods a little higher off the ground. because that's actually a lot of the problem in a crop like lentils is it's so close to the ground that the harvest losses alone, if those early first pods are hanging, right on the ground, it's hard to sometimes get those. And then often there's just not enough ground cover to even maximize yields in some of those parts. So that's what it's an almost opposite approach that we take with wheat and canola and corn. But we've found it to be fairly successful. And I know there's been a fair amount of research in beans that has also found a similar thing. So good opportunity in this field, the variable rate, some phosphate. And actually, I mean, I've got 40 rock in here as an example with a little bit of zinc in there, because the zinc also follows a similar pattern. So that can work really nice in those situations. So okay, that's another example. Another thing that's kind of interesting is you can manage seed safe rates of fertilizer. So starter products, maybe your average rate might be pushing the limit a little bit for a sandier soil that could be zoned as a zone 1. Well, we can manage that a bit if we need to by pulling back on the rates that would go in the seed row in that zone, right? So that's something else we do a fair bit of, and manage those accordingly. All right, so that's about all I had. Just wrap up, just a reminder, it's a SWOT map really is a soil potential map. It's not a yield map. It's not a satellite imagery map. That's usually the first assumption we get, but we really are actually measuring the soil. So that's the important thing. We like to say it's essentially a management framework that reflects the relative responsiveness to soil applied inputs. Okay, now that could be a number of different things. For like I talked about fertilizer, seed, and a bit of lime today. We've even done some stuff with soil applied herbicides, so pre-em products. It's kind of interesting. And in irrigation scenarios, we could even help it to guide variable rate irrigation too. In crop, we have been able to use the SWOT map as well for things like growth regulants in barley and wheat. Top dressing, sometimes we would use it. Even occasionally it can work fairly well for variable rate, or on-off fungicides, should a satellite image not be available, I guess, due to cloud cover. So usually for the on-off fungicides or desiccants like Reglone, we would ideally use a current satellite image, but sometimes we just can't get one. So the SWOT map can be a decent alternative occasionally. So that's I think that's all I had actually. Hopefully that gives a quick overview and good examples of how to use it in your region.
Okay. Thank you, Wes. Any questions from anybody for Wes or Gavin, or any questions about any of that stuff? I know it's been a lot of information in one day, so. Sound like it? Yeah, Wes, well, I really appreciate you doing this. I know it was pretty early where you're at, so thanks for coming in.
Oh, all good.
It's been a long day, so I think that's probably why no questions, but.
Yep, fair enough.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.